Hey everybody. Hi. Hope everybody's doing well. It's Wednesday, January 27th. I also always have to check the date. It is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And because of that, I wanted to have a conversation with Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the head of the Anti-Defamation League and someone who has been tracing hate speech and behavior for some time, and is a friend of mine who I've interviewed on a number of occasions. So we wanted to just talk to him not only about the importance of remembering the Holocaust this day. And there's Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. That was so quick and easy. You guys are very social media savvy.
I have good staff, I would say, but and I have a 15-year-old who's very helpful too. So those
Let's go
things, those things work.
again, Jonathan. I haven't seen you for a while.
It has been good. You did a great job on Mara last week.
Thank you
You were
very
very,
much.
you were
Thank
excellent.
Thank you. So let's talk about the why this day, how this day came about. I mean, we
hmm
know how it came about, but the official remembrance of the Holocaust and why this is so important, Jonathan.
Yeah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, I think, is an important part of the public calendar. I think when we say never again and we try to remember the slaughter, the systematic slaughter of Europe's Jews from 1933 to 1945, and we keep in mind the other millions of people who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. It's so important that those lessons are seared into our brain so they inform not just how we make sure that we are attentive to issues of anti-Semitism, which is fundamental. Again, what happened, the systematic extermination of the Jews of Europe was 1,000 years in the making. But we also need to keep in mind, Katie, that we use its lessons to prevent genocide from happening anywhere, because we know that if we don't remember, we are doomed to repeat we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. So I think the Holocaust, while it happened long ago, and with every day that passes, we lose more and more survivors who can tell their stories. We've got to stay mindful in the present so we avoid something like that from happening in the future.
Can you talk about, Jonathan, alarming rise of anti-Semitism? You and I have talked about this before, but we
Yeah.
haven't had this conversation for probably a year or two. And
Mhm.
I'm sure you can give us a sense of what is going on in that arena right now in 2021.
Well, it's pretty amazing. I mean, we saw after a 15-year decline of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, and I should step back and explain, Katie. The ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in the world. We're one of the longest standing civil rights groups in the country. We've been at this work for over 100 years, fighting anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hate. And we have 25 offices across the United States that actively track anti-Semitic incidents. People call us, or we hear about something, and we verify every incident that we report. We've been doing that work for more than 4 decades. So, and what we do is we track acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. So the police only track misdemeanors and felonies, right? Again, acts of like vandalism and violence. We also look at harassment. So a child bullied on a playground, an elderly person yelled at a bus stop, something happening on social media, which we should talk about too. So after roughly, Katie, a 15-year decline since 2001, in 2016, something changed, and the number of incidents spiked 34% year over year. We were aghast at that. And it happened against the backdrop of a hotly contested presidential campaign when, white supremacists were coming out to campaign events and their memes were being tweeted or retweeted out by a particular candidate. In 2017, that surge increased 57%, the largest single year increase we'd ever seen. In 2018, the number dipped 5%, but in fact, 2018 brought us Tree of Life, the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. 11 people shot to dead while they were worshiping in a synagogue on a Saturday morning. And then, of course, 2019. 2019, we actually saw a 12% rise again, making it the largest number of anti-Semitic incidents the ADL has ever counted. Again, in more than 4 decades of doing this work, we'd never seen anything like it before. In 2019, brought us a mass shooting in Poway, California, brought us a mass shooting at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, brought us a home invasion in Muncie, New York, where a rabbi was stabbed to death. I mean, it was a very tough year. And of course, assaults happened in Brooklyn, off the charts. We're still looking at the numbers for 2020. It's still not all tabulated yet, but just 3 weeks ago today, you had these militants who rampaged through the Capitol wearing Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts, wearing T-shirts that said 6MWE, which means 6 million wasn't enough, wearing insignias and logos on their gear that were Nazi and white supremacist. So I think, look, that was a terrible day for our democracy. It was the most predictable terror attack in American history. But for Jewish people who watched, white supremacists chant, "Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville, then we saw Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts on Capitol Hill. Those are bookends, if you will, for this administration, this presidency, that I don't think we'll ever forget.
So I was going to say, to what do you attribute this really disturbing rise in anti-Semitic activity? It must be a multifold, explanation.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think anti-Semitism is sometimes called the oldest hatred. It existed long before President Trump, and it will persist after President Trump. But if we try to understand, well, why did this all go down this way over the last 4 years? Number one, leaders lead. And when the president, retweets anti-Semitic memes from his Twitter account, or credentials white supremacist media at events, or uses slogans like "America First," that was literally the slogan Charles Lindbergh used to demonize Jews ahead of World War II, or talks about globalists and George Soros, all these things. His language gives license, right, to others. So that is a lot to do with it, number one. And then number two, I think extremists really felt emboldened, particularly right-wing extremists, because again, he was repeating their rhetoric, right? He was mainstreaming their message. So they really, over the last 4 years, have recruited, have organized, have grown. And you saw that play out, of course, in Washington a few weeks ago. And then thirdly, I would point out, well, I guess I'll say two more things. Social media. Social media has really been sort of a breeding ground for bigotry, Katie, and in particular, anti-Semitism. It has festered and exploded. Just today, ADL released a report card on how the different platforms are dealing with Holocaust denialism. And they get failing grades. Take Facebook, for example. After Mark Zuckerberg announced just a few months ago the intent to classify Holocaust denialism as hate speech, up until yesterday, my staff found lots and lots of examples. I didn't look myself today, but that's why we gave them a D. So, and I think the last thing I would just say is, as we talked about at the top of this conversation, Holocaust, Remembrance Day, as the years pass and memories fade of the Holocaust, I think the collective guilt that people felt, the presence of it sort of mitigated, if you will, people's worst impulses. That's gone. And or at least we're losing that, which is why days like today are so important. And I'm so grateful we're having this conversation, because you calling attention to Holocaust Remembrance Day and reaching the millions of people who watch you, Katie, it has an impact, and a very good one at that.
I wanted to return to the topic of Donald Trump, because I find it ironic, Jonathan, that many Jewish Americans that Donald Trump was a friend of Israel. And so it seems to me there were two different ways to interpret his support of Jewish Americans. And I'm curious if you noticed that dichotomy as you were seeing this increase in anti-Semitism and hate speech against Jewish people.
Look, it's really a paradox, Katie. I mean, you started out, and I said this after he was elected. This was a man with Jewish children, with Ivanka and Jared, and Jewish grandchildren in the residence. We'd never had a president before with such close personal relationships, and some of his most trusted advisors were Jewish. And yet it was undeniable that he did these things during the campaign that emboldened extremists. And we know that because at ADL, we track extremists. And they were saying in their subreddits and on 4chan and in their different platforms, we feel emboldened because he's repeating what we've always wanted to hear. Look, it is very difficult when we are very reductive and say everything is good or bad, black or white. And there's no question that while the president did some things in terms of the Middle East policy that we think made a lot of sense. For example, take Iran. So whether you were for the deal or against the deal, there's no denying that Iran is the single largest sponsor of terror in the world. They're the one state in the world, Katie, that holds Holocaust denialism cartoon contests and that regularly spouts and amplifies anti-Semitism. So the president putting pressure on them, calling that out, we think that made sense. Or the president released an executive order dealing with anti-Semitism on college campuses. We think that made sense. And even the Abraham Accords, that's a landmark that we haven't seen since Camp David, bringing together Israel and UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and the Sudan. This is very positive. But while those things are positive, that doesn't mean you can ignore, once again, bringing in people like Steve Bannon or Sebastian Gorka, who have demonized some Jewish people, who have minimized the concerns of the community. And again, as we saw people in MAGA hats marauding up the steps of our Capitol building, I can't imagine a more horrifying picture. So while there's some good that he certainly did that people in our community, I think, like, and other communities, I should say, it's also impossible to ignore the totality of that administration. And I will say this, the demonization of your opponents, the denigration of institutions like a free press or an independent judiciary, and the delegitimization of the election, Katie, like, those things are not just bad. I mean, wounding our liberal democracy, that's bad for the Jewish people and all people. And ultimately, I think we've got to really weigh his administration, considering the full extent of his activities.
Let's talk about anti-Semitism on social media. You say, Jonathan, your report gives Facebook a D. They are trying to, according to officials there, get a issue. Is the genie out of the bottle? What should they be? And have you had any conversations with them? Because it's not only anti-Semitism, it's all kinds of isms that are going unchecked every day on these social media platforms, conspiracy theories, falsehoods, doctored videos. It's all part of what the Rand Corporation described as truth decay back in 2018. So what is the solution in your view? I hear a lot of complaints, and I feel strongly that it's really damaging our ability to have any kind of civil discourse, because people are taking in this information and believing it and getting their views reinforced by more information because the algorithms work. But I haven't heard many ideas for solutions. What do you think done, Jonathan? Anything?
Well, so there are a few parts. So number one, I really appreciate what you laid out in your question, because it's not just about anti-Semitism. Racism has festered on the platform. Anti-Muslim bias has exploded on the platform. Anti-immigrant xenophobia has really spread. So there are a lot of issues with all kinds of hate speech.
Misogyny, sexism.
Misogyny is rampant. So they are all issues. So that's number one. I think number two, look, like, I've talked to Mark and Cheryl and other executives at the company. They are good people, and I know they want to do the right thing. Unfortunately, their approach has been wrong. Maybe it's the libertarianism of Silicon Valley, or the laissez-faire attitude of the laissez-faire policies of the company, but elevating freedom of expression over everything else is a consequential, and I think ultimately not a good decision, because freedom of expression isn't the freedom to incite violence, right? Freedom of speech should never be the freedom to slander. But their willingness to tolerate that and treat it as a bug in the system rather than a fatal flaw, it was really fundamental. At the end of the day, if you had a product, like a drink, that was poisoning your customers. I used to be an executive at Starbucks. If we had a coffee or a bottle drink that was poisoning our customers, we would pull it off the shelf and fix it and then put it back. Facebook's never been willing to do that.
I asked Cheryl that question at a Vanity Fair summit, and I got the impression they would never entertain doing something like that.
Ordinary companies, think J&J. When J&J had a problem with a few bottles of Tylenol in the 1980s that killed people, that were tampered with, they took every bottle off every shelf in America and redesigned the packaging and then re-released it. When Odwalla had a product, because the way they pasteurized the juice, a few bottles gave people E. coli. They pulled every bottle off the shelf in the United States and reformulated it. Like, that's what most industries do. And by the way, I just think about you and your career in broadcasting. If any of the broadcast networks where you had worked, right, literally put the kind of stuff on there that they did, QAnon conspiracies, allowed armed militias to organize, spread racism that like denied the humanity of George Floyd, and so on and so forth, all broadcast networks would be liable for that. There's a reason why white supremacists can't write op-eds in the New York Times or can't stream their videos, right? Or put their videos up on HBO. But like, again, on Instagram or Facebook, it's been free reign for far too long. So how do you change it? I'll say a few things. Number one, the company needs to commit to it. And the idea that they can't handle it, this is one of the most innovative companies in the history of business. They've got the most sophisticated, advertising platform in the history of capitalism. If they want to fix this, they could do it like that. So I think they've got to apply the resources, Katie, and give this the priority that it needs. So number one, they need to use their innovation engine on this. And then I think number two, to be perfectly candid, I think government needs to look at this and ask the questions, are laws like the Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, do we need to revisit that relieves Facebook of any liability, but holds NBC or HBO or CNN or frankly any other media outlet in business accountable? Like they're a media company and they need to be treated like one.
Yeah, they claim not to be a company. Of course, they claim to provide the pipes from which the content flows. But
well, if I might, like either you're a media company and you trade at those multiples and you bear that responsibility, or you're a utility. You provide pipes like the water company. Then you should be regulated like the water company, right? The water company can't privilege access for one customer over another. The water company has to provide rates at a reasonably. The water company, because it's a utility, lives in a certain like legal regime that's different than private companies. So I think at the end of the day, what we've now learned after 16 years of Facebook is we have to choose. The company has to choose, and I think our policymakers have to choose.
Are you optimistic that there will be steps towards some kind of regulation with this new administration and democratically controlled Congress?
Well, I got to tell you, I've talked to plenty of Republicans as well as Democrats who are concerned. Right? Republicans and Democrats are worried about the persistence of hate on the platform, how it's been exploited by extremists. So if there ever was an issue where you could have some bipartisan cooperation, this could be it. I think that the new administration has already indicated a strong desire to look at these issues. President Biden has talked about a return to decency and the soul of America. I think in many ways, the soul of our country is being played out on social media. And so if he really wants to get that right, he's going to need to look hard at this problem.
Jack Dorsey has said that Donald Trump will be permanently banned from Twitter. Do you think that he should be able to, I know he has expressed interest in starting up his Facebook account again. I know that instances, I think you all did a report, like they declined 73% after President Trump was taken off Facebook. I mean, you can explain what you found in that study, but do you think he should be allowed back onto the platform?
The short answer is no. I'll give you the longer answer. So basically, ADL last summer, because we were concerned about what was happening on Facebook with armed militia groups and racist content and Holocaust denialism, we organized a coalition called Stop Hate for Profit. I did that with the NAACP, Color of Change, LULAC, Free Press, Common Sense Media, a bunch of great civil rights and child advocacy groups. And we called on Facebook to deal with the issues, the rampant hate speech. When they didn't do it, we asked advertisers to take an advertising pause on the platform for the month of July. When we started that, Katie, we had a set of simple demands. When we started that, we didn't have a single company lined up. After about 3 weeks, we had over 1,000 of the biggest brands in the world: Disney, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Starbucks, Unilever, VW, Honda, Hershey's. It was amazing. And guess what? Facebook made a series of concessions that we demanded. So that was very successful. Now, again, implementation ultimately is the test, but they have hired a civil rights VP. They have reclassified Holocaust denialism. They took down the QAnon conspiracies, all stuff that we asked for. Flash forward. On January the 8th, after the attack on the Capitol, Stop Hate for Profit kind of reconstituted itself, and we called on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to permanently ban President Trump for violating their terms of service again and again, for spreading disinformation, and literally for fomenting this attack on the seat of our democracy. We did that on the morning of Friday the 8th. By that evening, Jack Dorsey announced he was going to take Donald Trump off of Twitter permanently. Facebook reclassified their temporary suspension to being quote unquote indefinite after we demanded it. YouTube, a couple days later, announced they were suspending him for a week. And I'm proud to say that they have continued that suspension since then. So does he deserve to be suspended? Look, in any other industry, like if you abuse the services that are being given to you, right? If you deface and disgrace the retail environment where you're eating dinner or shopping, they throw you out. In any other business. So I think it was long overdue for them to throw Trump out for, again, serially violating his platforms. And I really strongly disagree, Katie, with those people who say that's censorship. These are private businesses. They have the right to decide who they serve. The Supreme Court has proven that rule. It's not protected speech, again, when you abuse a product or service. So I think it was the right decision. I hope they'll keep him off. And Donald Trump can, go find some other service in which he can spread his hate. But as you pointed out, when he came off the service, when he came off of Twitter, Signal Labs, and we documented this, reported a 73% decrease in disinformation. 73%. And I think ultimately these social media sites have a responsibility to make sure the information they're putting out, just like any other media company, is accurate, is credible, and doesn't mislead the public. And I don't think that's too much to ask for.
What if you got on and followed the terms and conditions of being on any of these platforms?
If he were willing to do that, unfortunately, I think we've got 4 years of evidence, or really more, that he's never been willing to kind of play by the rules. If he were able to, then I think he would have the rights and privileges of any other user. But ultimately, to your question, Katie, that's not my decision to make. It's Facebook's, or it's YouTube's, or it's Twitter's. And I think what they've seen, and not just them, right? Reddit, Shopify, Twitch, so many other platforms have said, you know what? And if you think about this for a minute, Katie, we're living in a world now. Larry Fink just released another one of his reports earlier this week with Davos, where all businesses are talking about their values. Sometimes it's called ESG, sometimes it's called social justice, but I think companies need to decide, how do I put values throughout my value chain? And look, I think companies have the right to say who they want to do business with or not. And if you're not going to obey by basic values, decency, equality, if I dare say it, humanity, then they don't have to give you a platform. It's not a God-given right. And to that end, I would say, like the companies who decided they're no longer going to give political donations to candidates who support sedition, that's kind of common sense. And I think it's the right thing to do. So in this case, my hope would be that the platforms will stand by their values. I think that's what their customers want. I think that's what their employees want. And I think ultimately that's what the public needs.
Jonathan, I know you have to go in a second, but you called correct capital, quote, the end of the beginning, and that we're moving into a dangerous new phase. I noticed that the department also issued an ominous warning about further violence by domestic political extremists, I think, today. What do you expect to happen in the days and weeks to come? How concerned are you? And is there anything that we as a society can do about it?
That's a good question. So the ADL has been tracking extremists for longer than any other NGO in the country. Literally, we started doing this in the 1930s when there were Nazi sympathizers, railing against FDR and trying to keep America out of the war and propagating for the Third Reich right here. And we started working with the government back then. So it's literally been, 80 years of this kind of, almost 90 years plus of this kind of collaboration. So I did say it's the end of the beginning. And here's what I mean. I think we're about to watch domestic extremists enter a brand new phase in their campaign against the government. What happened on January the 6th, it's a good thing that many people have already been arrested. I think every one of them should be identified, arrested, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But make no mistake, that was a watershed moment for the white supremacist movement in this country. There was literally several hours where they seized the capital of the United States. Literally, they had legislators cowering under tables while they were smashing the doors and windows of this temple of our democracy, assaulting police officers with American flags, beating a police officer to death with a fire extinguisher. And had they had their way, Katie, there would have been far more people killed. And I just want to underscore what we know at ADL because we track these people. In fact, we were so alarmed before Wednesday, we put out an analysis on Monday the 4th, warning the public, warning the authorities, because we knew who was coming. They weren't hiding it. And so what I would say is that the people who bounded up those steps, those weren't protesters, they were militants. This wasn't a riot, it wasn't an attack. And a lot of the things that we initially said have now been documented. They had maps, they had targets, they used hand signals. There were a lot of ex and current military and law enforcement people in that mix. And so, why do I say it's the end of the beginning? Because now that they're being driven off the big platforms, and now that we have a government who's saying they're not going to kowtow to right-wing extremists like the prior administration, I'm very concerned that they will mobilize and organize. Historically, we've seen these movements, Katie, they thrive in opposition to the federal government, right? They flourished under President Clinton. I'm sure you remember the horrible bombing of the Alfred Murrah building, right? They flourished under President Obama. So I think what you're going to see is organizing into cells. You're going to see an increase of lone wolf style attacks. I mean, we're very concerned about this. And I think that's why you saw the federal government issue this warning today. What we saw is not just Washington. Keep in mind, we saw last year, armed militias occupy the State House in Lansing, Michigan. We saw armed militias try to occupy the State House in Idaho. We saw them attempt to enter the Capitol in Oregon. And we know we've got this 70 million plus people. Of the 70 million who voted for President Trump, a large number of them believe that the president is illegitimate, that the election was somehow rigged.
A third of Americans, according to a recent survey, believe that Joe Biden is not the democratically elected president of the United States. But I think even more disturbing, Jonathan, 21% strongly support the seditionists who stormed the Capitol. That is 1/5 of the American population. And it was, to me, that number was so shocking. And in fact,
stunning.
Portrayed as heroes among some of these right-wing extremist groups.
So just think for a moment. In a country of 330 million people, if 20+% believe that the seditionists were right, that the government is illegitimate, that deserves to be taken down, let's just assume for a moment of that 60 million people, maybe 2/3 of them will never do anything about it. Okay, maybe 3/4. But imagine for a moment now, 15 million people enraged because over 4+ years, they've been pummeled again and again and again with disinformation from Fox News to Facebook, that the government that things are rigged, that the institutions are dysfunctional, and that they're being, sought upon. So yeah, when I say it's the end of the beginning, I think what we saw, the way that I think about January the 6th, we had hardcore extremists, like I said, in Charlottesville. And we had hardcore extremists who also showed up on Capitol Hill. But here's the other thing, Katie. You had tens of thousands of ordinary Americans who also came. Not card-carrying members of a militia or white supremacists, ordinary people who were frustrated and angry. And yet somehow they followed the militants up into the Capitol building. And they took pictures and selfies on statues. It was really disgraceful. But in that, what you saw was the normalization of extremism. The idea that this is okay, to clearly break the law. I don't think I'm making news when I say that's clearly a violation of almost every law imaginable. And so, when we imagine now tens of millions of people who think the government is illegitimate, maybe, if you will, 60 million who think those seditionists who sought to kidnap and kill members of Congress are somehow credible or in the right, I think we've got a big problem on our hands. And it's going to take not just the DHS and FBI to double down, although they will need to. We need a whole of society effort to fight this, Katie. We need government at the federal, state, and local level to not only go after the bad guys, we've got to think about how can business be involved again in making sure that they're using their values across all of their decisions. We need civil society to step up and say, how do we find ways to bring people together and to de-radicalize in the same way we've seen in parts of the Middle East? This is going to be a long battle, Katie, and it's not going to be easy. And I think we've really got to buckle down. It's really going to be the fight of our lives.
I think what's confusing sometimes, you hear mixed messages. One, build bridges, be more inclusive, reach out, and then on the flip side, make people accountable, hold people accountable for their behavior. And so I think it's hard to figure out how to navigate between those two
Yeah,
actions.
it's a fair point. But I mean, if you look at like South Africa, after, Mandela was elected, they had a truth and reconciliation process. Times we're held accountable. So I think in order to have unity, you've got to have accountability. It's not either or. And these people who say, I heard Senator Rubio say recently that to hold the trial for President Trump is pouring like gasoline on the fire. Like, I couldn't disagree more. We need to move into a moment where no one is above the law, where impunity doesn't reign. Whether you're the president of the United States or the president of the local PTA, all of us have to, I think, not just obey the laws, but hopefully live by a set of norms. So it won't be easy. It really won't. But this is why the damage of the prior administration, I don't think we'll really understand the extent of it, Katie, for years. And we'll be dealing with the debris, if you will, for a very long time.
Well, again, it's Holocaust Remembrance Day, moment to make sure we never forget. As you say, there are fewer and fewer survivors now. And so I think it's important for everyone to take a moment, read about the Holocaust, refamiliarize yourself with what happened, and remember those 6 million souls that were lost, and vow that it can happen again.
As the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, it really means a lot to me to be here today. And I think your words imploring people to read and watch and listen and really learn, really take in and process what it means for us as citizens, for our communities, for our country. I don't think there aren't many more important lessons than that.
Well, Jonathan, I always really appreciate talking to you because you are so eloquent and informed and help us understand critically important issues that really are the cornerstone of our country and our democracy and our civil society. So thank you for this conversation. Great to see you as always.
It's nice to see you too, Katie. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone.